Picture this. You wake up one morning, you check your phone, and every headline is screaming the same thing. Iran closes the Strait of Hormuz, and within 24 hours, before most of the world even understands what that means, gas prices double, stock markets crash, airlines cancel thousands of flights, and world leaders are on emergency calls at 3 a.m. This isn't a movie. This isn't a war game simulation at the Pentagon. This is a real scenario that military planners, oil traders, and geopolitical analysts lose sleep over every single night. Because here's what most people don't realize. There is one strip of ocean, just 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, through which roughly 20% of the entire world's oil supply passes every single day. Every single day. And the country that sits right next to it, Iran, has threatened to close it multiple times. So today, we're going to answer the question that keeps energy economists and Pentagon generals up at night. What actually happens if Iran blocks the world's oil supply? Buckle up, because this is bigger than you think. Part 1. The Strait of Hormuz, the world's most dangerous choke point. Let's start with geography. Because to understand this crisis, you need to understand the battlefield. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow waterway connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and then to the open Arabian Sea. On one side, Iran, on the other, Oman and the UAE. At its narrowest point, it's only about 21 miles wide. That's roughly the distance from downtown Los Angeles to the beach in Malibu. And through this tiny strip of water passes 17 to 21 million barrels of oil every single day. That's approximately 20 to 21% of global petroleum liquids, about one-third of the world's liquefied natural gas, LNG, shipments bound for China, Japan, South Korea, India, Europe, and the United States. Now think about that for a second. One-fifth of all the oil on Earth that moves through global trade passes through a channel the width of a suburban commute. Countries like Japan import over 90% of their energy. South Korea, same story. China, the world's largest oil importer, depends heavily on Gulf crude. India is growing faster than almost any economy on Earth, and its oil appetite is enormous. All of them dependent on this one choke point. Now here's where it gets scary. Iran doesn't just sit next to the strait. Iran effectively straddles it. The Iranian coastline runs along the northern edge of the strait. Iranian naval bases are positioned within easy striking distance of any tanker trying to pass through. Iran has fast attack boats, anti-ship missiles, naval mines, and submarines. And Iran has said, loudly and clearly, on multiple occasions, that if it ever faces an existential threat, if sanctions choke its economy, if the United States or Israel attack it, it will close the Strait of Hormuz. In 2011, Iran's Navy commander Habiballah Sayari said closing the strait would be easier than drinking a glass of water. In 2019, after the U.S. killed top Iranian General Qasem Soleimani, Iranian officials again raised the threat. This isn't hypothetical saber-rattling. These are calculated, deliberate warnings from a nation that has studied the strait's strategic value for decades. So what actually happens if they pull the trigger? When oil spikes, inflation fears spike. When inflation spikes, interest rate expectations spike. When interest rates spike, everything gets repriced. The S&P 500 could drop 10 to 15% within the first week. That's not a prediction. That's based on historical models from previous supply shocks like the 1973 Arab oil embargo and the 1990 Gulf War. Airlines, shipping companies, manufacturers, retailers, their costs all explode. Profit margins collapse. Layoffs begin. Supply chains. Here's what people forget about oil. It's not just gasoline. Oil is in everything. Plastics, fertilizers, pharmaceuticals, synthetic fibers, rubber lubricants, asphalt. When oil prices spike, the cost of making almost everything goes up. And when you add shipping disruptions on top of that, the global supply chain, which was already fragile after COVID, starts breaking down again. Food prices rise. Medical supply costs rise. Construction costs rise. The inflation effect. Remember 2021 to 2022 when inflation hit 8 to 9% in the US and many European countries. Economists estimate that a sustained strait closure could push inflation back to those levels or higher, almost overnight. Central banks would face an impossible choice: raise interest rates to fight inflation and risk crashing the economy, or hold rates steady and let inflation run wild. There is no good option. The GDP impact. Some estimates suggest that a prolonged closure of the Strait of Hormuz, lasting 3 to 6 months, could reduce global GDP by 1.5% to 3%. That might sound small, but global GDP is roughly $100 trillion. 1.5% of that is $1.5 trillion. Wiped out, gone. In jobs, in savings, in business closures, in economic misery. Part 4. The geopolitical firestorm. Who does what? Now, let's talk about the geopolitical chessboard. Because every major power on Earth has a different response to this crisis, and not all of them align. The United States, the U.S. military response would be swift and massive. The U.S. Fifth Fleet, one of the most powerful naval forces on Earth, is literally stationed in the region. Within 48 hours of any Iranian blockade, the U.S. would be mounting freedom of navigation operations, attempting to escort tankers through the strait under naval protection. But here's the complication. Escorting tankers through a mined waterway, under threat from Iranian anti-ship missiles and fast attack boats, is extraordinarily dangerous. Iran has Russian-designed and domestically produced anti-ship missiles. The Nur missile, the Qatar missiles with ranges of 100 to 300 kilometers. A U.S. Navy destroyer is a formidable vessel, but a tanker carrying 2 million barrels of crude oil is not a warship. The U.S. could clear the strait militarily, but it would be a real military operation, with real risk of escalation, casualties, and a full-scale war with Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf states. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, these countries are in the Persian Gulf. Their economies run on oil exports. A closed strait is an economic catastrophe for them too. But here's something interesting. Saudi Arabia has pipelines that bypass the strait. The East-West pipeline runs from the eastern province to the Red Sea port of Yanbu. At full capacity, it can move around 5 million barrels per day, bypassing the strait entirely. The UAE has the Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline, which can move about 1.5 million barrels per day to the port of Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman, also bypassing the strait. Combined, these bypass routes can handle maybe 6 to 7 million barrels per day. The world is still short 13 to 14 million barrels per day. China's response is the wild card. China is Iran's largest oil customer. The two countries have signed a 25-year strategic cooperation agreement. China has been buying Iranian oil in defiance of U.S. sanctions for years. Would China try to broker a deal, or would China use the crisis to further weaken the U.S.-led global order? China would almost certainly oppose any U.S. military action at the UN Security Council. But China also cannot afford a prolonged oil supply shock. Its own economy runs on that Gulf crude. This is the paradox of China's position. They're Iran's economic lifeline, but they're also deeply dependent on stable energy markets. Russia would love this crisis. Every day the strait stays closed, oil prices rise. Russia, which earns massive revenues from oil and gas, profits, but Russia has also been trying to project itself as a responsible global power. And a full-scale war in the Middle East carries risks that even Moscow can't fully control. India imports around 40% of its oil from the Gulf. A strait closure is an economic emergency for New Delhi, but India has historically tried to maintain independence from both US and Iranian pressure. Expect frantic diplomacy from India, trying to find any solution that keeps the oil flowing without joining a war. Japan and South Korea, they have strategic petroleum reserves, but at current consumption rates, Japan's reserves last about 90 days. After that, economic catastrophe. These countries would be pushing every diplomatic lever available to resolve the crisis, while simultaneously making defense preparations they hope they never need. Part 5. Can the U.S. military actually open the strait? This is the question that wargame analysts spend careers on. The short answer, yes, but it's not clean, and it's not fast. The U.S. military has unmatched power projection capability. It has carrier strike groups, guided missile destroyers, mine-clearing vessels, submarines, F-35s, and B-2 stealth bombers. But clearing naval mines from the Strait of Hormuz would take weeks to months, not days. Mine clearing is one of the slowest, most painstaking operations in naval warfare. And while U.S. forces are clearing mines, Iran would be shooting missiles. Iran has hundreds of anti-ship missiles deployed in hardened sites along its coast. It has speedboats packed with explosives. It has drones, lots of drones, many of them battle-tested in proxy conflicts across the region. The U.S. would win a full military confrontation with Iran. That's not really in doubt. But winning in the traditional military sense would require airstrikes on Iranian missile sites, risking Iranian retaliation against U.S. bases in the region. Potential Iranian attacks on Saudi oil infrastructure. Iran could try to blow up Saudi Aramco facilities as it did in 2019 on a much larger scale. Possible Iranian proxy attacks from Hezbollah in Lebanon, Houthi forces in Yemen, and Shia militias in Iraq. A military operation to reopen the strait could easily cascade into a regional war involving half a dozen countries and non-state actors. And wars have a way of getting out of hand. Part 6. The world's emergency responses. If the strait closes, the world doesn't just sit there. Emergency systems kick in. Strategic Petroleum Reserves, SPR. The U.S. has the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, about 350 to 400 million barrels stored in underground salt caverns in Texas and Louisiana. The International Energy Agency coordinates emergency reserve releases among member nations. If IEA member countries release their strategic reserves simultaneously, they can put roughly 10 to 12 million barrels per day into the market for a limited time. This buys time. It doesn't solve the problem. And if the strait stays closed for 3 to 6 months, reserves run out. Alternative energy sources. U.S. shale oil producers would ramp up immediately, but ramping up shale production takes time, weeks to months, not days. And U.S. shale production is already near record levels. There isn't infinite spare capacity sitting idle. Russia and other non-Gulf producers would try to fill the gap at much higher prices. Demand destruction. When prices get high enough, demand drops. People drive less. Industries cut back. Governments ration. This is economics working as intended, but the human cost is enormous. Recessions, job losses, business failures. Part 7. The long-term consequences, a world changed forever. Let's zoom out. Say this crisis lasts 3 months, then gets resolved through diplomacy, military action, or Iranian domestic political change. What does the world look like after? Energy security becomes the #1 priority for every nation on Earth. Every country that got hit by this crisis learns the same lesson. Dependence on a single choke point is suicidal. The investment in alternative energy, renewables, nuclear, domestic production accelerates massively. Not because of environmentalism, but because of pure national security calculation. The acceleration of de-dollarization. One of the things Iran and its allies, China and Russia, want is to break the US dollar's dominance in global oil trade. A crisis like this, where the US has to militarily intervene, creates enormous resentment among nations that see themselves as caught in the crossfire of US-Iran tensions. Expect faster moves toward trading oil in yuan, euros, or other currencies. Iran's position transforms. If Iran successfully used a strait as a weapon, even briefly, it dramatically elevates its negotiating power. It proves to the world that it can inflict catastrophic damage on the global economy. Future diplomacy with Iran, about its nuclear program or anything else, happens in the shadow of that demonstrated capability. The oil market never fully trusts the Gulf again. Insurance premiums in the Gulf stay elevated permanently. Shipping companies invest in alternative routes. Nations accelerate the diversification of their energy supplies. The Gulf's leverage over global energy, which has been central to geopolitics for 70 years, begins, slowly, to erode. Conclusion. The most important 21 miles on Earth. Here's what we've learned today. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a waterway. It is the central nervous system of the global oil market. It is the single point of failure in a system that the entire modern world depends on. And Iran, a nation that has been under severe economic sanctions, that has developed nuclear capabilities, that has built a network of regional proxy forces, and that has every reason to feel cornered by the United States and its allies, sits right next to it. This is not a distant, abstract threat. In 2019, Iranian forces seized a British oil tanker in the strait. They attacked Saudi oil facilities with drones. They shot down a U.S. surveillance drone. The world came frighteningly close to a full military confrontation. The question isn't really if there will be another crisis in the Strait of Hormuz. The question is how bad it will be, and whether the world has learned anything from every near miss that's come before. Because right now, as you watch this video, somewhere in the Persian Gulf, Iranian speedboats are patrolling. Tankers loaded with millions of barrels of crude are threading through those 21 miles of water. And the world's most dangerous neighborhood is holding its breath. If this video made you think, share it, because understanding how fragile our global systems are is the first step to building something more resilient. Drop a comment. Do you think Iran would ever actually close the strait, or is it all just a bluff? And subscribe, because this is the kind of content that your newsfeed is never going to show you.